Hi, my name is Misty Kruger, and I teach at the University of Maine at Farmington. I'm really excited to be speaking to you today at the virtual JaneCon 2021. I would like to begin by noting that UMF sits on the traditional agricultural lands of the Abenaki people of Amisconti. The title of my talk is Lopt and Cropt, a look at Jane Austen's line edits to her teenage writings. I begin with an overview. So today I will talk about Jane Austen talking about editing and revising, and I'll turn to a piece of correspondence to do that. Then I'll share with you what I think is some inspiration for her editorial attitude in that piece of correspondence. We'll look at 4 examples of edits to her juvenilia, and then we'll think a bit more about what the mature writer's thoughts on her early work convey to us. So here you see an image of a letter from Jane to Cassandra. This is a letter from January 29th, 1813. In this letter, Jane Austen talks a bit about the recently published Pride and Prejudice. She says there are a few typical errors, and a said he or a said she would sometimes make the dialogue more immediately clear, but I do not write for such dull elves. And even though she has these quotation marks around that passage, it's actually not a quotation. It's a paraphrase of Sir Walter Scott's poem Marmion. She continues, the second volume is shorter than I could wish, but the difference is not so much in reality as in look, there being a larger proportion of narrative in that part. I have lopped and cropped so successfully, however, that I imagine it must be rather shorter than Sense and Sensibility altogether. So we keep in mind here that Sense and Sensibility was her first published novel, and then came Pride and Prejudice. I'm interested in what inspired those words, lopped and cropped, and it just so happens that while I was thinking about this, I watched a production of Richard Brinsley Sheridan's The Critic, and then decided to go read the play again. As I was doing that, the words lopping and topping, as you see boxed on the screen here, just jumped out. I just thought to myself, I recognize this passage. And I think that we can put Austen and Sheridan together here because the Austens were Sheridan fans. And The Critic is the play, but I think the whole Sheridan kind of concept is the mode that I want you to think about. So in Act 2 on page 78, we have a character from the 1779 play who is named Puff, and he is the object of the critic's satire. So the critic is a satire on stage conventions. It follows the theater critics Sneer and Dangle, and then playwright Sir Fretful Plagiary, as they watch a rehearsal for a play called The Spanish Armada that this kind of poetaster named Puff wants to put on. And Puff has penned this ridiculous historical melodrama, which includes some overwrought emotion, the artificial plots, and ludicrous scenes of madness. And they're just having a really good time watching this guy make a fool of himself. So Puff is talking to Mr. Hopkins in this scene, Mr. Hopkins being like the stage manager. And Mr. Hopkins is explaining to him that the actors have taken the knife, the axe, the pen, right, to his play. So Puff says, so, this is very fine indeed, Mr. Hopkins. How the plague could you suffer this? And Hopkins from within yells, well, sir, indeed, the pruning knife. Cut off by Puff. Puff goes, the pruning knife? Zounds, the axe. Why, here has been such lopping and topping, I shan't have the bare trunk of my play left presently. Very well, sir, the performers must do as they please, but upon my soul I'll print it every word. And then Sneer does what Sneer does and sneers. Says, ooh, that I would indeed. So Puff sees that the actors have pruned his play. They have axed elements of his play. and he looks at the lopping and the topping. But for Austen, it becomes cropping, and it's very much like what she does in that paraphrasing of Scott. So Austen lops and crops, just like in The Critic. She also prunes. And so today we'll also look at the pruning knife and the axe in looking at the examples from Austen's works. So I want to begin, before we do that, by just talking about the difference between editing and revising. And of course, I want you to think about how that puff reference is really a reflection of Austen's snarky attitude on editing. And when I use the word snarky, I do it with so much love. I want you to think about the evidence from the Juvenilia that shows Austen's editorial practice, which I am referring to as lopping, cropping, pruning, and axing. And as you do that, I want you to think about how Austen's editing is an example of wordsmithing. And this wordsmithing is an action, right? It's a practice, but it's also an attitude that Jane Austen has about linguistic superfluity. Sometimes there's just too many words. I want to contrast all of this with revision. When I think of revision, I am thinking along the lines of what a lot of scholars have said about Austen's work, in that revision reflects significant changes to characters and argument. I'm not looking for those. I am looking for the editing that has to do with the wordsmithing. At the end of the presentation here of this talk, I have a slide that gives you a whole list of scholars whose work you can follow up on if you want to read more about revision and as people have thought about it in relation to Jane Austen. So today we'll focus on the lopping and the cropping, the editing of the Juvenilia. And here you can see this is the cover of the first volume of her notebook. This image comes from Jane Austen's fiction manuscripts, which is located at janeausten.ac.uk. And the rest of the images that I will go over are also from that website. So the Juvenilia has what I'm going to say could be called puffed up language. And this puffed up language is somehow edited by Austen either while she's copying the original Juvenilia into the notebooks or after she's copied it and then she reads over it. And I think that we could probably make a case for both. So Jane Austen wrote her Juvenilia when she was just a teenager. This is approximately between 1786 and 1793, and then later in life decided to copy them into 3 notebooks. And some scholars believe this began around 1809 and may have continued over the course of many years later. When we look at these notebooks, we really need to think about what it is that we're reading. And I have to admit, for a very long time, I was so focused just on the teenage writings that I wasn't really thinking about these texts as material things, right? That these books exist, and what do they mean when we think of them as books? So I've been thinking about the fact that obviously there were originally drafts that Jane Austen had written, and we could call these foul papers. So for these papers to be foul, it's not that they're gross or ugly or terrible. It's that they're considered drafts. They are considered works from which somebody would want to do more work with. So the original teenage writings, I'm going to say, we can call those foul papers. But then we find that they were transcribed, they were copied into the 3 notebooks, and so therefore we could call those fair copies of her teenage writings. But because the fair copies actually include things like strike-throughs and insertions, what we actually have is just 3 notebooks that are edits. And so I think they get back to being foul papers because they are not edited in the terms of kind of getting it ready for that final copy. If someone were to take those edits and then transcribe a new copy, we would get back to fair copy. So what do we find in these edits? What do we find that actually shows that the Juvenilia was still a work in progress? We'll start by looking at things that have been lopped off. And so to lop is to cut off from the main body. The example I want to share with you is from Love and Friendship, specifically letter the 9th, the first sentence. So you can see on the screen here that the text originally began with these 2 lines that have been stricken through, and for some reason Jane Austen changed her mind. So let me show you what was there and what she ended up with. So she originally had, when we were somewhat recovered from the overpowering effusions of our, we should assume, right? That's what would come next. And she decides that's not what she needed. Either she decided, I don't like it. Either she decided that's not what I meant to copy. I don't know. All we know is that she was in the middle of a thought, writing out a word, didn't even finish it, and was just like, whoa. So this is what I was saying about her editing while she's copying. So instead of it beginning when we were somewhat recovered, it ends up with towards the close of the day. We received the following letter from Philippa. Now let's look at some cropping. So lopping was taking something off the top, and cropping is taking something off the bottom, like getting a short haircut. So we will look at something that's been cut very short. We're going to look at an example from Jack and Alice of a cropped paragraph. So there you see, the first line now ends with a period and a quotation mark, and then 4 other lines have been scratched out. Here's how it's transcribed by Jane Austen's fiction manuscripts. So now the sentence ends and the paragraph ends for what they may do. But originally it said for what they may do, a woman in such a situation is particularly off her guard because her head is not strong enough to support intoxication. If you don't know, get ready for this. Jack and Alice is all about intoxication. So it's kind of interesting that she would take out that reference to intoxication, but maybe she changed her mind after the fact, thinking, I don't want to make this statement about women being off their guard, about women not being strong enough to handle their drink. I don't know. What we would want to do is go back and read the entire text and look at the passages that have been cut like this one and see how does that affect the way we understand the characters or the argument. When we do that, then we start talking about revision. Moving on to the pruning knife. The pruning knife is the knife that comes along and says, we need to get rid of some extra stuff. So to remove superfluous material is what it means to prune, and we're going to look at an example from the Three Sisters. In the Three Sisters, there is a passage that has not only strike-throughs, but insertions. So you can see above some of those lines that have been stricken, some words have been added. And here's what that looks like. So originally, pearls, a reference to Arabian Nights, rubies, emeralds, topazes, sapphires, amethyst, turkey stones, agate, beads, bugles, and garnets. That's what was there, but has somehow been cut for whatever reason. And all that we're left with is pearls, rubies, emerald, and beads. This is interesting for a few reasons, one of which is the reference to the Arabian Nights and the princess is cut. Why is that the case? Is it that it was just an unnecessary point? Is it that maybe when Austen was younger, she thought that was a great reference, and now as she's older, she's changed her mind? Don't know. But I think it does have something to do with her maturity. Also, the pearls, rubies, and emeralds and beads are significantly cut down from the whole list. So why don't we have the topazes, the sapphires, the amethyst, the turkey stones, the agate, and so forth? And why keep the beads? That's another thing, right? Pearls, rubies, and emeralds make a lot of sense, but beads, they don't make as much sense. But maybe she wanted to keep this idea of variety while really excising the superfluity that was in that list. And now my favorite, the axe. So zounds the axe, right? This is a curse phrase, right? It's God's wound. So, it's bad words. But yeah, we apply it to Jane Austen anyway. To axe is to cancel suddenly and ruthlessly. And I think we see the best example of this in a fragment written to inculcate the practice of virtue. Here you see on the screen that Jane changed her mind. So she had written out the title, she had written out the entire piece, and then came back to it. Don't know when, don't know why, but just decided no. And I can almost feel not just one no, but multiple no, 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 strike, strike, cut, axe. You can feel the force of that decision. It's almost violent. And what's interesting is that what she cuts is not very interesting. So I'll read it to you, and I want you to think about, did she cut it just because it was boring? Is there something in there that wasn't appropriate for her niece, or like, why is it gone? So here's what the axed fragment says. It says, "We all know that many are unfortunate in their progress through the world, but we do not know all that are so. To seek them out, to study their wants, and to leave them unsupplied is the duty and ought to be the business of man. But few have time, fewer still have inclination, and no one has either the one or the other for such employments. Who amidst those that perspire away their evenings in crowded assemblies can have leisure to bestow a thought on such a sweat under the fatigue of their daily labor?" It's not my job in this talk here to tell you what that means, but it's to offer it up to you to say, what do you think that means, and why do you think it's been cut? What is it about this passage that had to go? But I also want you to think about it in the context of what surrounds it. So here's the page that comes before. And this page is addressed to her niece, Miss Jane Anna Elizabeth Austen. And because it's addressed there, you assume that the next page that follows is also to her niece. So she begins, "My dear niece, though you are at this period not many degrees removed from infancy," so yeah, she's a baby, "yet trusting that you will in time be older, and that through the care of your excellent parents you will one day or another be able to read written hand, I dedicate to you the following miscellaneous morsels, convinced that if you seriously attend to them, you will derive from them very important instructions with regard to your conduct in life. If such my hopes should hereafter be realized, never shall I regret the days and nights that have been spent in composing these treatises for your benefit. I am, my dear niece, your very affectionate aunt, the author." So here we have that, and then we have the first page gone. Forget it. Something's not right with that one. Maybe just not good enough. Didn't pass the buck. Here's the page that follows, which now becomes the first page in the series. A beautiful description of the different effects of sensibility on different minds. This is pretty long, and I'm not going to read the whole thing to you, but you can follow up by looking at Jane Austen's fiction manuscripts. You can read it in its original handwriting as well as you can read the transcription. It's really interesting that instead of beginning with this pretty dry and vague, boring practice of virtue, Jane Austen elects to begin with sensibility. So we have some conclusions that we can draw from this, these 4 samples. And the first that I want you to keep in mind is that this looks like Jane editing, not just for the purpose of publication, but just for the purpose of editing, right? That the juvenilia shows us that she returned to her writing not because she thought she was going to have a public audience, but because she just felt like it needed to be edited. So while her letters talk about editing and revising with the purpose of publication, her manuscripts show us what she was doing just for the sake of attending to language, of striking passages that didn't work, and just of rethinking the things that she had written years beforehand. But my favorite thing about what this shows us is that I think that her editing is really mirroring kind of two versions of Jane Austen. So I'm going to call these the two Janes. So we see in that copying of the juvenilia that control, that controlled author, that controlled mindset. But then when we get to the revision sometimes, the edit sometimes, we see that she's impassioned, that there, especially in that axing, is just slice and dice, cut, cut, cut. And I think that this is the sign of a maturing writer. And this is still someone that I believe is revising and editing all of the things that she's written and is thinking deeply about how she can move from, first attempts, first tries, from drafting, from her original imaginative scenarios into the quality of writing, the quality of the prose that she wants to have and that she's developing. I think this is an attempt for her to balance that preservation of that young writer's intent and her young imagination, but also to kind of step it up and to say, I like these ideas, but some of these sentences just don't work, or this opening falls flat, and that she's thinking rhetorically and she's thinking grammatically and she's thinking just at even the smallest kind of piece of punctuation. So for me, this is all really exciting. And none of this is in opposition, right? The two Janes are not in opposition, but they're overlapping. And so I particularly enjoy thinking about Jane Austen with that writerly control, but also the kind of impassioned writer who says sometimes you have to cut things and you can't slice it just, 2 times, but maybe it needs to be 15. Murder that text. As I said, if you want to see more of Austen's edits, please go to Jane Austen's fiction manuscripts online. It is such a storehouse of materials, and you will just enjoy it so much. If you want to end up in the scholarly world thinking a little bit more about revision as the people who've spent their time thinking about her revision, I recommend that you check out some research by Catherine Sutherland, Brian Southam, Michelle Levy, Linda Bree, Peter Saber, Janet Todd, Christine Alexander, David Owen, Jocelyn Harris, John Wiltshire, Hilary Havens, Marcia McClintock Folsom, Katie Gemmell, and Katie Halsey. And even though this looks like a long list, I'm sure there are many more people who have written about Austen and revision, and so forgive me for any names I've left off this list. I want to thank you for listening to me talk about Jane Austen. It's pretty much my favorite thing to do. And if you want to follow me on Twitter, that would be super. If you want to email me to talk more about any of these things, I would love that too. You can reach out to me at misty.kruger@maine.edu. I hope you enjoy the rest of the con. I know I will.